Burn the box.
I'm here to talk to you a little bit about the realities that are on the ground and the real chance for Africa, which is the continent where I come from. I'm from Zambia. What I would like to do today is really appeal to logic, reason, and evidence as opposed to emotion. I think the world, celebrities, politicians, policymakers have done an amazing job in the last 50 to 60 years to convince us or to delude all of us into believing that the only way we can approach the Africa question is through pity and looking down in terms of looking down on the African continent. We seem to forget as a global society that there are more poor Chinese people on earth than there are poor Africans. There are more poor Indians on earth than there are poor Africans. And yet, if you think about the way we think about Africa, we look at Africa in what I call the four horsemen of Africa's apocalypse. We focus on war, disease, poverty, and corruption. Almost nothing good comes out of the African continent. And I'm here today to argue that we as a global society must start to look at the Africa question, and in particular the issue of aid and how we as a global society are trying to address the issue of poverty in Africa in a much more realistic and sensible lens. We have a lot of evidence about what works in terms of creating jobs and creating economic growth. Let's not forget that China has moved 300 million people out of poverty in our lifetime, and we know it wasn't by sitting back and relying on aid. And at the same time, it's not just China, it's India, it's Russia, it's Brazil, and even countries like South Africa and Botswana on the African continent have meaningfully put a dent in poverty in our time. And yet, at the same time, we know that there is not a single country on earth that has relied on aid to the extent that African countries rely on aid today that has reduced poverty and created long-term growth. And I'll come back to this point later, but let's remember these facts. I'd like to start off by saying that it's very easy for people to categorize, and I know Westerners love this. They like to say, oh no, she's black or he's white, and he's Republican or she's Democrat, or he's pro-aid and she's against aid. And I think that actually detracts from a lot of the things that we know to be true and where we have a lot of common goals. So I think there are three things in particular where we all agree. And the first thing that we all agree on is that Africa should not rely on aid forever. I think we all look forward to a day where Africa can be an equal partner on the global stage and not rely on aid to the extent that the continent does today. And by the way, I always give people an option. If people feel like they want to see Africa remain in poverty and remain aid dependent, you're welcome to put your hands up and we can have that discussion. But I think we all agree that we would like to see a time when enough is enough. African countries are, and Africans are equal partners and does not rely on aid to the extent that it does today. The second thing that we all agree on is that African governments have to be front and center on the development agenda for the African continent. It doesn't matter if Western policymakers or celebrities or individuals or even African individuals like myself care about economic development. If African governments are not on board, we cannot expect that the situation will turn itself around. And this is critical because somehow people think that we can get development going in Africa without the African governments if we somehow just do good and approach things in our own way. Well, that's not going to happen. We need to get African governments involved and incentivized to do the right thing. The third thing that I believe we agree on, I have to confess, is actually not my point. I stole this from Minister Sondheim, who's the Minister of International Development in Norway. When my book came out earlier in the year, I was invited to Norway, and I'd never been to Oslo. I was quite surprised because many of you will be aware, I'm sure, that Norway gives about 1% of its income to aid. So I was quite surprised, why is this minister inviting me to visit? But I had never been to Oslo, and I thought, you know what the heck, it's a nice trip to go and see what it's like there. And I had a fantastic time there, and I'm sure people who have spent a lot of time with people from Scandinavia will know that they're very, very open. They love to have debates, and it was absolutely wonderful. We had a number of public debates with a number of journalists, and at one of the debates, Minister Sondheim said, and I'm paraphrasing, but he said in public, we have to accept that aid has contributed to the dysfunctionality of African governments. And I almost fell off my seat. I was like, Minister, you're making my case for me. And I think this is a critical point, that we have to accept that, whether we like it or not, our good intentions of giving aid to Africa have created dysfunctionality across the continent, especially amongst our governments. And I must remind you, because the second point was that we need governments involved, to have a system of aid that is actually creating government dysfunctionality is problematic. I will just add here that the manner of the dysfunctionality that aid creates obviously varies. In the worst case scenario, the things like corruption emerge, and I'll come back to this point later. But even in the best case scenario, where we see good governments in Africa receiving a lot of aid, there's a situation where African governments are allowed to abdicate their responsibilities. And I'm going to come back to this point later, because this is the crux of the issue. When you go to vote for your presidents or prime ministers, the expectation is that those governments will provide you with public goods, such as education, healthcare, infrastructure, and security. In Africa, those goods, by and large, are provided by the international community. And that is where the problem emerges, because even good governments in Africa are not providing public goods. Somebody said to me, actually, we should stop wasting our time voting for African governments. We should start voting between the Gates Foundation and USAID, because they're the ones who are providing the public goods. I mean, it was kind of a joke, but actually, if you think about it, that's exactly the political system that many Westerners live under. So anyway, those are the three things I think we agree on. We don't want Africa to be on aid forever. We want African governments to be incentivized to do the right thing. And again, I think we all have to agree that aid has contributed to dysfunctionality of the African states. I'm going to spend a little bit of time here, just for a minute, explaining to you what I mean by aid, because this is one of the things that people have wanted to throw tomatoes at me for. A lot of people, in fact, one NGO started a campaign against me saying I was going to kill African babies, and that I wanted to stop helping many millions of African babies that are dying across the continent. In fact, I think Jeffrey Sachs even said, this book has been written by a woman who doesn't have any children in rural Africa. I'm assuming he doesn't either, but maybe he'd like to tell us something. In any case, the point here being is that in the book, I basically delineate three types of aid. There's emergency or humanitarian aid. So, for example, think of Katrina or a flood. As in Brussels today, you might be getting some aid after the floods here. Think about the tsunami or what happened in Indonesia not too long ago. But the point being that I believe as part of a global community, we do have a responsibility to act wherever it may be when that type of a tragedy emerges. So my book is not about humanitarian or emergency aid. The second type of aid is what I would call NGO or charitable aid. And think of this as relatively small amounts of money that we give, $10 to buy a mosquito net in Zambia, or $15 to Kenya to send a girl to school. I myself am involved in a number of charities, but the fact of the matter is, let us not delude ourselves. This type of intervention is not going to miraculously make Africa grow at the level of economic growth that it needs to grow to reduce poverty and create jobs. By the way, I should remind you that over 60% of Africans are under the age of 24. In many countries in Africa, over 50% of the population is under the age of 15. So we've got a very, very young population. We need to create jobs. We don't need pity. We don't need sympathy. We need jobs. And here, it's really important to remember that, yes, you can send 10 euros to a child in Ghana, and maybe she will go to school, but if the economies are not growing fast enough, when she graduates, she will not be able to get a job. This is critical. And it's very, very important also because a lot of people spend millions, billions of dollars each year rallying support to throw more money into the African continent without really thinking about what the implications are longer term of creating such a dependency cycle. My book is not about NGO or charitable aid. That should be the sequel. I will probably write a book about that. And it's important to also stress that these two types of aid, humanitarian aid and NGO aid, have problems. But the book is not about that. The book is specifically about a third type of aid, which is the government-to-government aid flows, large billion-dollar packages that go from not just governments, but also the big international aid agencies. Estimates of aid going to Africa this year at about $100 billion a year, going over the last few years and projected for this year. And let us go back into the 1950s and think about what it was that motivated people to start this whole aid regime. It was post-World War II, Bretton Woods had been established, and it was on the back of the success of the Marshall Plan, where we had seen what is equivalent to about $100 billion being sent into Europe and used for reconstruction and development. So people were quite excited. They thought, gosh, if it worked in Europe, why should it not work in Africa? And I have to confess, if I had been a policymaker in the 1950s and 60s, I would have been a big supporter of aid because conceptually it made sense. We know savings leads to investment, leads to growth, which is a simple economic identity. But if there's no saving, why don't we give them aid, which should lead to investment, which should lead to growth, which should reduce poverty? It absolutely made sense. But here we are today, about 50 years later, and there has been over $1 trillion of aid sent to Africa. That is about $100 for every man, woman, and child on the planet of Earth today. I don't know about other planets, but I'm sure we can add that in as well. But the point being that growth over time in many African countries has actually declined. In fact, Paul Collier, who I think we'll be hearing from a little bit later, talks about Africa shearing off from the rest of the world. So the rest of the world's going in one direction, Africa's going in a different direction. But also look at the poverty statistics. In 1970, 10% of Africans lived on less than $1 a day. Today, over 70% of Africans live on less than $1 a day. Something is wrong. I do not want to sit around and wait for it to be 90% of Africans living on less than $1 a day. The notion that throwing in an additional $50 billion to Africa is somehow miraculously going to move the needle is completely ridiculous. So the question then becomes, why is it that such a good idea, such great intentions of giving money to African countries actually is fraught with problems? Why is it that we're seeing higher levels of poverty? We're seeing Africa shear off in terms of growth. What is the problem? And also with respect to growth, the United Nations, just in terms of a target, has said that we need African countries to grow at around 7% a year in order to meaningfully put a dent in poverty. The reality is that African countries are growing now, for this year, projected, IMF projections are more like a 1.9, maybe 2%. I'm going to very quickly go through some of the reasons why aid doesn't work. I'm getting my 4-minute signal over there. I'm not going to tell you all of them because I want you to go and buy the book, but hopefully this will be a bit of a teaser. Let's get the most obvious reason why aid is not working in Africa out of the way, which is corruption. I think if you went outside right now to Brussels Midi and asked people why they think aid doesn't work, most people would say, oh, corruption. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this because I think it's very clear. The fact that there's money going into these countries that has no requirement for certain behavior means that we know it's often stolen and diverted and used for other projects. Some of my critics have said, oh, you know, that's an old story. Well, I'm afraid to tell you, no, it's not. My own former president's embroiled in a scandal of stealing money as we speak. Same next door in Malawi. The president there has got a lot of problems, having stolen allegedly $12 million that was earmarked for HIV/AIDS. The story goes on and on. Look at Transparency International rankings. There's a reason why African countries are consistently at the bottom. Money is getting stolen. Things like inflation, the debt burden, Dutch disease, this whole idea of dumping in billions of dollars and causing a strengthening of our domestic currencies, which kills off the export sector. These are problems that are not Dambisa Moyo cooked in her kitchen. They're very well established in the literature of development. In fact, the IMF, look at the IMF literature itself, you will see that a lot of this discussion about the problems of aid is pretty well documented. Things like civil war has been written about, the fact that money pools at the state level and you end up with all these factions. People are always constantly trying to get rid of the government because there's no other source of capital. We don't have big private sectors. It should come as no surprise to many people in this room that Africa this year has had 4 coups already, 4 overthrows of government, coup d'etats. My parents said to me recently, I said, yeah, can you imagine there have been 4 coups this year? They said, Dambisa, it's only November. Just wait. And I think that's an important point. But also, remember that in Africa, in the 1990s, had more civil unrest and civil war and civil failed states than the rest of the world put together. There's a reason for this. We're not developing the private sector as we would like to see it develop. Linked again to the aid culture is that there's money coming into the society, which means that governments don't need to tax their citizens. Look at the World Bank Doing Business Around the World survey. Consistently, African governments, African countries ranking at the bottom, causing a lot of problems, not creating entrepreneurship, not creating business flows. I could go on and on. I would just say, ignore everything I've said thus far. The biggest problem with the aid culture is that it disenfranchises Africans. I find it completely ridiculous the number of times you go to these big concerts and everybody's there waving their hands, listening to celebrities about Africa. We actually elect our presidents. You should want to hear from our presidents what the plan is. However, we've got this absurd situation where you rarely hear from African presidents and Africans are disenfranchised. It's virtually impossible for us to hold our governments accountable. They spend more time courting and catering the international donor agencies than they do listening to Africans on the ground. That is a problem. I'm getting the sorry we're closed sign, which means I have to go, but I will just leave you with a quote from a Nigerian friend of mine who said, why do you think it is that people continue to give aid when we know that aid is such a big problem? And it basically boils down to low expectations. People don't actually believe that Africans can do it and can achieve economic success. And his exact quote was, Africa is to development what Mars is to NASA. Every year they spend hundreds of millions of dollars doing research and experiments and discussions and surveys. But the fact of the matter is nobody believes that we'll ever live in Mars. And the fundamental problem is that nobody ever believes that Africa will succeed. Thank you very much for your time. I appreciate it.